Hey there, listener. Welcome back to Conservative Conversations. Our guests today are William Batchelder and Michael Harding, who are the co-editors of a forthcoming volume on Philip Rieff, who's an important sociologist and analyst of culture and student of, indirectly, an analyst of Sigmund Freud. So we talk about Philip Rieff, his complex theories of culture, repression in the wake of Freud, what Freud does to culture, the three worlds, first, second, and third order worlds, and the potential coming of a fourth order world. So we hope you enjoy the episode.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Gentlemen, welcome. We're talking about Philip Rieff today, but for starters, before we get to Rieff, I want to know more about you both. Where do you guys come from? What do you do?
I was born in New York, largely raised in Texas, did my undergraduate degree in anthropology and philosophy at the University of North Texas. I went to the University of Dallas to study philosophy, and then I was very lucky in that I took a course from the great Leo de Alvarez on Plato's Laws, and in truth, it kind of radically changed my interests, my concerns. I had wanted to study philosophy of language and 20th century phenomenology. And then when I took the course on the laws, I realized there was this whole new world of things that I was much more interested in and that seemed much more important. And then I was lucky enough while at Dallas to study with Tom West, Leo de Alvarez, who I mentioned, Tiffany Miller. And I really had a kind of life-changing education there. And I would say that it's the kind of education that, let's say, situated me well to approach someone as difficult and painfully obscure as Philip Rieff. And then maybe the other thing I'll add is that I got into Rieff because Bill sent me the book one year. He sent me Death Works for Christmas, as you do. And I went to Florida and spent my time on the beach reading Philip Rieff.
Light reading. I was reading Philip Rieff on the beach this past weekend, too. That's funny you should say that.
I can't think of anything sunnier and more summery than My Life Among the Death Works. I'm William Batchelder. I was born in Medina, Ohio, which is in Northeast Ohio. Undergrad, I went a couple years to Grove City, then I transferred to St. Andrews. After St. Andrews, I went to Ohio State University, and I got a master's and a PhD also in medieval history. And so I started out really as a medievalist. And actually, I was studied with Dr. Joseph Lynch at Ohio State, which is a great honor. God rest his soul. He passed away when I was finishing my dissertation. And then Dr. Barbara Hannawalt was gracious enough to take me on. So I finished my PhD actually working on Gerald of Wales, and who's a 12th century church intellectual and man of letters. I'm now at Waynesburg University, where I'm the honors program director and an associate professor? Yeah, an associate professor, and living in southwestern Pennsylvania. So, greetings from coal country. Actually, I owe ISI a little bit here, I have to say, for my interest in Philip Rieff, because I went to an ISI conference in Indianapolis in 2006, and they would give away books, and they would give away the University Bookman and I think Modern Age also. Mm-hmm. So I went and got my little stack of books and magazines, and I think in the University Bookman, though I'm not positive, I have it sitting around somewhere, there was a review of My Life Among the Death Works. And I thought to myself, this sounds amazing. So I went and got it. And then I found myself reading. First, I read that. And then Charisma, which I have a long-running interest in his theory of charisma. And then just everything. And then I found that rather than wanting to just apply what Rieff thought to other things I was interested in, I really just wanted to work as a sort of an expositor on Rieff. And so this weird, unhealthy obsession, Michael suggested, well, why don't you do an edited volume? You have all this interest and you've interested other people through the Ciceronian Society. I'm the chairman of the Ciceronian Society, and Michael was good enough to join our board. He said, why don't you we know so many people now that read him, why don't we do an edited volume? And so the edited volume, which is called The Philosophy of Philip Rieff, Cultural Conflict, is it Cultural Conflict, God and the Self?
Let me double check. You think I know the title. Cultural Conflict, Religion and the Self.
Religion and the Self, which will be forthcoming, God willing, from Bloomsbury. The manuscript is turned in, and we've got one peer reviewer back who's very pleased with it. So we're just waiting on the edits. But that was Michael's idea, and we were blessed to be joined by a bunch of really good contributors, including Elizabeth Lash Quinn, who was the only one of us who's actually met Philip Rieff. She spent time with him in his extreme old age. I think she met him in 2005 or 6. And then we had contributors from lots of different schools. Michael, help me bring to mind some of Carl Truman from Grove City.
Carl Truman, Chris Annandale from Mount St. Mary's, Paul DeDuke from Colorado, I believe Boulder, Kevin Slack from Hillsdale, Ethan Alexander Davey down at Campbell University, Jacob Wolf just moved to the University of Austin. I'm leaving people out. Help me out with this.
Yitzhak Ofek, who was working on a postdoc in Chicago when he joined us. Josh Bowman from the Ciceronian Society is one of our chapter contributors. And I know we're forgetting a couple people, and I apologize to them.
Well, we're forgetting ourselves and James Patterson.
There is that. We mentioned Carl Truman from Grove City, right?
James Patterson.
Ah, yes, James Patterson from Ave in Florida.
Hey there, listener. I wanted to take a quick moment to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission here at ISI is educating for liberty. If you'd like to join us in fulfilling our mission, consider helping us by rating and reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen, to help us reach more listeners like yourself. Now, back to the show. So, a very good group of fellow travelers and friends. I was at the Ciceronian Society conference this past March in Texas, and I got to meet a lot of those people. So, who is Philip Rieff?
Philip Rieff was born in 1922, died in 2006. He was the child of very poor Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, from near Lithuania, right?
From Lithuania, yeah.
He was so poor, according to the very hostile to Rieff biographer of Susan Sontag, a guy called Moser, that he actually slept in the bathtub for a time. I think his brother and his father both ended up as butchers at Safeway. So if you ever see a picture of him, you have this person who looks like he was raised on an aristocratic manor somewhere in Buckinghamshire. And in fact, he came from inner city Chicago, from a very a tough background, a working class background. He was very much invented himself. He was a self-created character. He was already teaching at Chicago before he'd even finished his doctorate. Such was his obvious promise. He married one of his young students, Susan Sontag, who was 19 at the time that they got married, but obviously already herself on the way to being a theorist. The marriage was a disaster, and they had a brutal, vicious divorce in the early 1960s. One of the articles that I've written about Rieff, which is online, is refuting Moser's claim that Sontag was the actual author of Rieff's first book, the 1959 publication Freud, The Mind of the Moralist. This is an absurd claim. We demonstrated the absurdity of it. After that divorce, he went on. He was all over the place in academic positions, but he would ultimately land at the University of Pennsylvania in the Benjamin Franklin Chair of Sociology. In 1966, he published Triumph of the Therapeutic, which finished solidifying his reputation as an extremely important intellectual. And then he decided that a great thing to do, having achieved the status that most intellectuals would give their left arm for, was to set it all on fire. So in 1973, he published a book called Fellow Teachers, It was based on a series of lectures at Skidmore College, later published as Fellow Teachers of Culture and Its Second Death, where the most important arguments are in the footnotes. The prose is completely impenetrable. He decided not only not to separate the chapters into readable parts, he didn't bother separating it into chapters. It is absolutely unapproachable, which is just how he liked it. And what you had emerge with Fellow Teachers, and then later on, the extremely important epilogue to the third edition of Mind of the Moralist, which came out on the 20th anniversary in 1979, is an absolutely forbidding prose style, which he then retained throughout the rest of his writings, though he did relax it a little bit at the end, but not much. And then nothing. Except for some articles, he stuck to the seminar and didn't publish any major books until the year of his death in 2006. Deathworks came out, My Life Among the Deathworks, as part of a trilogy, the Sacred Order Social Order trilogy, which included My Life Among the Deathworks in 2006. Here I have it here, since we're on video. My Life Among the Deathworks in 2006, The Crisis of the Officer Class in 2007, The Jew of Culture in 2008, and his students also put together his incomplete work on charisma, which is, I can't recommend highly enough, refuting Weber's central concept of charisma and how it works, called Charisma, the Gift of Grace and How It Was Taken from Us. And if I'm not mistaken, that also was out posthumously in 2007.
Thank you for that introduction. I know he was also the editor of Freud's collected papers.
Was early on.
Yeah, it's funny that you should mention the impenetrable prose, because I was reading Triumph of the Therapeutic, which he says in his introduction he tried to keep it an approachable style, and I was like, this is a very hard book. This is not for the faint of heart or the faint of mind. But yeah, I want to know about Freud, because that seems to be, at least in Triumph, and also in his first book, The Mind of the Moralist, where he's doing a lot of his analysis of how we are a post-Freudian society, or Freud's impact on how we view ourselves. So what is the sort of the upshot or impact that Freud has per Rieff?
Michael, do you want to take this one, or do you want me to do this one?
So I think at a certain point, I'm going to defer to you. You've spent a lot more time on Freud than I have. One of the things that I find so interesting about Rieff's approach to Freud is that he's not approaching him from within the discipline of psychology.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote his dissertation on Freud for the political science department at Chicago. Previously, he had written his master's thesis on Coleridge, I believe. Again, for the political science department at Chicago. So Rieff's approach to Freud is, I'm tempted to say, maybe a deeper and more probing and more searching approach than one would find from many people who were schooled in psychology. He's able to put Freud into maybe a wider dialogue than someone who was more specialized. And Bill and I have kind of gone back and forth on this a little bit, whether we want to call him an anti-Freudian Freudian or something else. He ultimately, I think, would claim that Freud's analysis of what we might call the economy of the soul has a lot to recommend it, but it's incomplete. Rieff is, and Bill can speak to this much more effectively than I can, Rieff wants to say that Freud he reaches a point where he is unwilling to press his theory in the direction that it needs to go. He runs up against the limits of, I guess we can call it the third unconscious, which is the ground of the repressive imperative. And Freud just kind of says, here I stop. I'm not going to go any further than this. And Rieff, and Bill can explain this probably better than anyone else, Rieff wants to say that this third unconscious is the ground of, let's call it authority. I was trying to think of a way to explain what he means by authority.
It took me 50
authority was, authority with a capital A emerges out of this third unconscious. So there is a sense. Well, I'll just leave it at that and let Bill get at this with some more detail.
So one of the things that we said in the introduction to the book was that one of the reasons Rieff is so fascinating is because he's a thoroughgoing modern who regards modernity as a moral and spiritual catastrophe.
Mm-hmm.
And he's a Freudian who's turned against Freud. And so in one sense, like Michael was saying, with the economy of the person, you don't want to say soul with Freud, but
Right.
with the economy of the person, the sort of tripartite economy of the person, and especially the idea of repression, which Rieff said it cannot be abolished. He is very much a Freudian, but he turns against Freud in I think two places which are really important. And Michael introduced the first one already, which is that Freud taught that there are actually two unconsciouses. And I simplify this maybe to a point which is unacceptable in the essay that I do in our compilation. Essentially, the first unconscious is the id itself. It's the drives. The second unconscious is repression, the act of shoving those drives back down because they can't, for whatever reason, be expressed. But Rieff says that Freud, in fact, and this is one of the wonderful things about Rieff, he's a genuinely humane scholar who will always give credit to somebody else for having the idea before he did. He does this with Rieff, he does it with Weber, he does it with, well, kind of with Nietzsche too, right? But he'll always, when he's criticizing someone, at the very point of his criticism, he'll say, well, of course, he thought of this himself. He just didn't want to go any further. Rieff never does the insecure scholar thing where I thought of a thing that Freud didn't, or I thought of a thing that Kafka didn't, or I thought of a thing that Weber didn't. He says, they thought of this. And the way Rieff always says it is they're so trapped in their own theory that they won't take this thing that they've seen themselves to its logical conclusion. So he does that with Weber and Charisma. He does that with Freud on this question of the unconscious. Freud posited the third unconscious, which is so important to Rieff's theory, and then he just refused to follow through on it. And Rieff believed that he was refusing to follow through on it precisely because he was captured so much by his commitment to a kind of a dogmatic atheism, which Freud, we can't prove that Rieff is a theist, by the way. I spend 50 pages sort of exploring the question, which is close that you're going to get. But the dogmatism of Freud's atheism bothers Rieff. It's the one point in Mind of the Moralist where he's really critical of Freud, while not indicating that he's any kind of theist himself. He just doesn't like that approach. It's not philosophic. But then he says, so of course, dogmatic atheist that he is, when he gets to the question of what is it which causes the repression? So we have the drives, we have the repression. What is it that causes the repression? Freud posited a third unconscious and then sort of punts. And Rieff sort of wryly says, Freud will admit repression into his theory only on the condition that it becomes his unresolvable problem. Right? Because otherwise he might have to go beyond it and find out what it is that causes repression to happen. And what Rieff says is what causes repression to happen is authority. And he says, and the central problem of my essay is, what does Rieff mean by authority? Because he is deliberately unclear. But it seems to be in at least some way external to the individual. And the guy who's really good on some of this is Zondervan, wrote a book on Rieff. And it was Zondervan actually corresponded with Rieff to try to nail him down on some of this. And in his correspondence with Rieff, Zondervan basically does an exposition that Rieff kind of refused to do, where Rieff ultimately is arguing that Freud thinks that the drives are at the essence, at the heart of the person. So in other words, if you're going to boil the person down to the primary process, and that's Zondervan's phrase, but it's a really good one, then the primary process for Freud is the drives. For Rieff, that cannot be, because he says a theory is a vision of the highest. The drives are chaotic. You can't have a theory with chaos at the bottom. So what Rieff says is the primary process is when culture preconsciously sinks its expectations into each individual self and then constantly reinforces those expectations both externally and internally. Externally, right, by what we think of as religion, or what Rieff would call the interdicts, the commands, the thou shalt nots. Internally, because every time a person obeys those expectations or the teachings that go with him, what Rieff calls inwardness sometimes, and other times character, is enforced. This is the other place he turns Freud on his head here. So first of all, he says Freud doesn't have the courage to find authority in the third unconscious. Right? Then the second place is Freud said, and backing up one step, the superego is not the conscience of a Catholic priest, which in confession he's attempting to strengthen, or the Orthodox priest that he's attempting to strengthen in confession. The superego is irrational and persecutory. And in Freud's understanding, the ego originates with the person. The id originates with the person. In other words, that's hardware, that's cooked in, that comes with you when you're born. The superego is created by the clash between the drives and the expectations of the outside world, which won't allow them to be realized. So the superego can't be rational because it exists before the person is rational, and it exists as a hand on a hot stove being burned. It's not rational. It's flinching. It's persecutory. And so what Freud says is to cut down on people's suffering and to unravel their neurosis, it may very well be necessary for us to soften the demands of the external culture so they don't suffer so much. Rieff turns this on its head. Rieff said, oh no, it's very true that when you obey the conscience, the superego is strengthened. But Rieff says, but that's a good thing, not a bad thing. It leads not to an even more irrational and persecutory superego. It leads instead to inwardness and a conscious. And furthermore, he says that is the only way we become individuals. So everybody's alike in their drives. Thanatos and libido are the same for everybody. Now, obviously, in our current culture, we celebrate the myriad of ways one can pursue libido. But in essence, Rieff believed that wasn't a true individuation. True individuation does not come from giving vent to the desires because those fundamental drives are the same in everybody. True individuation, true individualism, true character comes up, and we become more ourselves in the ways that we resist the drives, not in the ways that we give into them. So to abolish the demands that are sunk into us by culture as character is to abolish people as truly individuated, character having, and again, sometimes he'll say soul making, is to interfere with the process of soul making. So it's a very serious thing to have a society that says it's forbidden to forbid, or which wants to relax all these demands. It's a devastating thing, Rieff believed, for each individual character. So that's kind of where the break from Freud comes.
This is fascinating, especially as I'm reading Triumph. All of the stuff that you're saying makes a lot more sense, because I was trying to figure out, he says early on that religious society or religion, or basically pre-Freudian civilization, had its own therapeutics within it, as in this sort of interplay between what he calls like remissions and the interdicts, I think. And then what I was sort of getting a little bit lost in was, A, what does that even look like? And B, how does he seems to suggest that Freud is stripping us of that, or after Freud, the therapeutic man, psychological man as an entity lacks that sort of interplay or intertension, and I think that sort of ties to what you're talking about. But what is maybe we can explain or delve more into how pre-Freudian civilization has its own therapeutics within its sort of interdicts and its structure that causes people to, I guess, form the superego, as you were putting it. And then what happens afterward in the psychological man?
Michael, do you want to do the via?
Yeah. Well, or at least the three worlds. Um,
Yeah.
I think this is actually also kind of getting at the key to what really attracted me to Rieff. I wrote my dissertation on Nietzsche, and I was struck that Rieff and Nietzsche are dealing ultimately with the same problem,
Mm-hmm.
which is to say, what happens to society, what happens to culture, what happens to politics, what happens to human life after the death of God.
Yes.
So Rieff wants to identify, broadly speaking, three epochs, and he does suggest that there might be ways in which this broad tripartite schema doesn't quite work. And this is reflected in the title of the trilogy, Sacred Order, Social Order. So the premise is that all social orders are in some sense reflective of a sacred order, whether we're talking about taboo and fate in what we might call pagan first worlds, whether we're talking about the sacred order underlying revealed religion, in the case of Judaism, Christianity, not that Rieff addresses it, but one could make the case that Islam falls under this as well. And then what he calls third culture differs from first and second culture, or the first and second world, in that there is no thing outside of itself by which it takes reference, to which it takes reference. In other words, in third culture, there is no sacred order that is reflected in the social order. So third culture is characterized by the absence of God or the gods and the lack of any external authority or any sort of sacred order that could ground the norms of the social order. Whether we're talking paganism, whether we're talking the Abrahamic religions, or anything along these lines, that would in turn be able to place limits on what Rieff calls, and again, this is one of those kind of arch postmodern puns that he likes to make. He speaks of the pop, the primacy of possibilities. And one of the things that these earlier cultures are meant to do is they're meant to put restrictions on that. There's this range of possibilities for human beings. And one of the things that Rieff would say a healthy culture does is it kind of says, well, yeah, this is not a possibility for us. This is not a possibility for our group. Yes, this is a thing that one might do, but one does not do it. One ought not to do it. So the way Rieff puts it, at one point he says, third culture is not a doctrine or a voluntary discipline of obedience to the truths of absolute authority, but tidbits of opportunity that depend upon energy available to exploit those opportunities. The most exemplary opportunities, he says, are shared with all animal life. Therefore, by the animal rights movement, the interest in food and sex. And then lastly, he says third culture is characterized by a relation to the past that doesn't treat the past as a source of meaning. You might think about the speech on the last man in Zarathustra. The last man knows everything that has happened, but it doesn't matter to him. Similarly, Rieff says that third world denial and negation of the past is primordial, and that the radical contemporaneity that it promotes will not be shut out of lives devoted to resisting it, let alone out of lives devoted to nothing at all. So you can kind of see this today. The most obvious example, I suppose, is that we've lost a kind of historical consciousness. If you talk to young people, what you find is that it could have happened 50 years ago, it could have happened 500 years ago, it could have happened 1,000 years ago. It's all just kind of the past. And we have a tendency today to not really take seriously the idea that we could learn anything from the past. Today we tend to think of this in terms of Nietzsche's description of the last man, Hegel's idea of the end of history, the idea that progress means we can disregard the past, certain problems are solved, we don't have to worry about them. But what Rieff is getting at is a much deeper cause of this orientation toward the past. We get caught in this, as he puts it, this radical contemporaneity. You could think about the 24-hour news cycle, I suppose, in this regard, right? You see these people constantly getting caught up with the latest outrage. So I think the parallel to The Last Man is pretty obvious. And you can even see this in like if you look at pop culture, this tendency to recycle the past. So in my essay in the book, I think one of the comparisons I make is the remake of Clash of the Titans from some years ago, where all of a sudden it's about an attack on authority. So you're taking the images, the cultural structures and symbols of the past, and you're using it to attack the possibility of any authority. But Bill wants to talk about the via, I believe.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. So in this schema that he has of the first culture, which is the culture of paganism, where you have this meta-divine, you have something which is above the gods. Think about the fact that Odin actually can't stop the Ragnarok and Thor, or that the gods are actually limited by the fates. There's this sort of thing even above the divine, and this is the sort of surging energy, which Rieff calls this primacy of possibility. He says the second culture rejects this. There's nothing above the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He created everything else. Nothing limits him. And if you go to the third culture, so much of the third culture is dedicated, particularly among their intellectuals, but even at the popular culture level, to not only rejecting, but to constantly attacking, parodying, mocking, and even just sort of hatefully venting at the second culture. And yet, human beings can't entirely repress the desire for authority. So what they do is, in sort of fictive, semi-conscious, in some cases deliberate, in other cases, they want to return to the first culture primacy of possibility. They want to go back. But as Rieff says, it can only be in parody form. It holds no real terror for them. The one thing they're not going to learn from the primacy of possibility is the lesson that limitless possibility turns men monstrous. That part they're not going to learn. But we see it once that observation that Rieff makes, man, once he makes it, you see it everywhere. So that's, permanent revolution. Capital P, capital R. That's the right side of history. That's, the class struggle. That's the Volk. There's all these sort of primordial motivations which allow you to lower yourself in what Rieff called the vertical in authority. Because after all, you're reaching out for this primal power. And obviously in pop culture, we see it in silly ways, the Force, in Star Wars, or the metaverse in Marvel, right? This is the primacy of possibility. This is a desire of people who hate authority, repressing the sacred, repressing the desire for authority, and it pops up in these sort of half-conscious returns to the meta-divine of the first culture. So the vertical in authority is how Rieff describes a functioning culture. Rieff says that culture is shaped not like a straight up and down line, but like a cross. And here you see the influence and rejection of Freud at the same time. He says that when people obey the interdicts, and the interdicts, that applies to the second culture only. There are no third interdicts in the third culture, in the modern culture, because it's forbidden to forbid. And in the first culture, you have taboos. The primacy of possibility is just, and this is my favorite phrase in all of Philip Rieff, the primacy of possibility is the, quote, constant energy of menace. And so the taboo walls you away from the constant energy of menace, but it's not rational. If you read Antigone, in a sense, nothing moral is happening here. You just have a contest of wills, and certainly Oedipus Rex. Nothing all, yeah, he killed a guy in a road rage incident, and isn't it tragic that turned out to be his dad? The implication being killing a different guy, right? So what Rieff argues is that if you look closely, this meta-divine is not moral. But in the second culture, the interdicts are. So in the second culture, when you obey the interdicts, you rise in the vertical of authority, the via, toward God, toward authority, right? Again, I say God, but of course you could never prove in Rieff that that's what he means. But you rise toward capital A authority. When you deliberately transgress, you lower yourself, right? So you can go down in the vertical in authority. And he says that the third culture is marked by deliberate lowerings. But people being what they are, which is imperfect, there's also, he says, shuffling in a sidling manner, or sometimes doing that which ought not to be done, but which is done with excusing reasons, right? And his word for not raising and not lowering, but this sidling action. Actually, Michael, help me. It's slipping my mind right now.
Good God, it's on the tip of my tongue.
Yeah, mine too. I'll think of it in a second. But you have this sort of cross-like shift. Remissions. He calls the remissions. And so he says some remissions maintain the vertical in authority, even while acknowledging that the person can't live up to them. Other remissions will curdle into transgression if it's allowed to continue. But a lot of our lives are in the muddling sort of middle of remissions. And so the importance of the charismatic, of the saint, is the constant hardcore observation of the interdicts to be a model, a character model of rising in the vertical in authority by self-denial. But most of us are engaged in sort of sidling behavior, trying our best to rise a little, failing a lot. And he said that's the model of the second culture, is that vertical in authority. But the third culture wants to level the whole thing. There's no rising to be done. And of course, to prove that, they sink, right? So ironically, in proving there's no rising to be done, right? You constantly transgress, yeah. But yeah, that's the vertical in authority, which is another one of his key concepts, because he says what he sometimes calls a functioning symbolic is one where the vertical in authority works, and if you lose that, you're in danger.
Okay, wow. And again, hopefully to the audience, this is demonstrating how complex or verbose Rieff is, not only in his words or his typologies, but also the way his brain thinks, or the way he thinks about all of these things, culture, repression, and all of this. It reminds me also, or something he says that I just sort of saw kind of in passing, but I thought was, that's interesting, is in My Life Among the Death Works. He says something to the effect that there can be no pure living in the second culture. Maybe you could delve into that idea a little bit more. Is this just a warning against utopian thinking, that we could ever have a perfect political and cultural space, or is this function of human sinfulness? What does he have in mind?
Michael, do you want to take that one?
I mean, I would take it as very much referring to remission again. There is this. The great thing about the interdicts is they give meaning, right? You have this, like when he defines symbolic, he says it's a pattern of moral demands, of standard self-expectations about what we may and may not do in the face of the primacy of possibilities. And the great thing about the interdicts is that they say, well, here's what you may and may not do. But there is this practical concern. If you think about Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics, in Book 3, he introduces the idea of mixed actions, right? Which is what I always think of when we get to that passage in Rieff, where Aristotle says there are things that one would never do as ends in themselves, but under certain extreme circumstances, you might undertake them as means to some other end, right? The classic example he uses is throwing cargo overboard. You wouldn't do that for the sake of throwing cargo overboard, but you might do it in a storm. Mm-hmm. So similarly, I think what Rieff is getting at is that you need to have this system of remissions within the vertical in authority. And this is characteristic of second culture, precisely because let's say the business of being alive necessarily means that circumstance will constrain you in some way. And you will occasionally have to deviate. So there needs to be a means of remission or reconciliation with authority for the fact of those deviations. Now, when you get to third culture, of course, there are virtually no deviations at all. Anything goes with third culture. So you kind of lose that need for the remissive. Is there anything you want to add to that, Bill?
No, I think that's good. And also the context of the Triumph of the Therapeutic is that Rieff is defending Freud and what he calls the analytic attitude, which accepts that your suffering can never finally be. Freud is no messiah. Freud believes that the idea of final deliverance from pain is itself a sickness, right? And that's why he defined religion as a sickness. And Rieff actually wants to defend Freud against his later disciples who want to provide some kind of secular salvation. And so Rieff, in that context, what he's saying is that Freud is closer to the truth than Jung, who's attempting to make a utility out of religion in which he does not truly believe. And I won't say anything more about Jung, I'll just leave it there. But or if you look at Wilhelm Reich, who everyone's going to be delivered by orgasm from their suffering and everything, or if you look at these people that are profoundly influenced by Freud, but they won't accept that there's no final solution to their pain. Freud said there wasn't. All you can do is manage it. And his most brilliant disciples, none of them would accept that. There has to be some deliverance. And so much of the Triumph of the Therapeutic is about these people that want to manufacture a deliverance and go beyond Freud. So I think the context of that is Rieff definitely takes Freud's side against Jung or Reich or those who are trying to offer through psychology, through therapy, any kind of final deliverance.
That makes sense. Is the authority then the third unconscious? That's not a deliverance. That's the mechanism by which the managing is possible.
And the authority is what is sunk into you as the sinking. This is why my article ended up being over 50 pages. Essentially, there's this incredibly difficult passage in the epilogue to the third edition of Freud, The Mind of the Moralist. And the epilogue is called One Step Further, because he basically says that Freud refused to go the one step further to the third unconscious, so Rieff is going to go the one step further for him. But Rieff, at this point, has gone deeply into his phase of unbelievably difficult and maddening prose. So working through that to the point where I thought I understood it took me weeks of rereading and writing extensive notes before I finally understood what he was driving at. But I don't know if I guess read my chapter. Essentially, what he's going to argue is that when authority is sunk into the person, there is a binary dividing of everything. Light from dark, good from evil, and so forth and so on. And the question is, I called my chapter The Peculiar God of Philip Rieff. When I first read that chapter, I thought that he believed that internal compulsion to divide everything into these binaries was basically God. That's the God impulse. As I got to rereading him again and again and again, it can't be that by itself. It's some sort of psychosocial process which is previous, sort of like the culture that's external to you is prior even to the drives, sunk into you. This binary separating of light into dark and good into evil, everything else, is the response to that. But then he's still incredibly obscure about where culture comes up with this. And so you have to get into the question of, does Rieff have a metaphysic at all? So every time he talks about authority, is he merely offering you a psychosocial analysis of what happens in the interior of each person as they're brought into a second culture society? Or does he actually believe that capital A authority is something like God? Is there actually a metaphysic here? And brother, you could go either way. which is one of the arguments I make, because I'm not trying to baptize a guy who ain't a Christian and who is frankly very hostile to Christianity until the end of his life. If you read what he says about Christianity in Fellow Teachers, it is not friendly. It is quite hostile to Christianity. But then at the beginning of Death Works, and I think it's because the full emergency of modernity has completely sunk in during this silence between 1973 and the end of his life. As that sinks in, he begins to refer to Christians and Jews as we. Well, he never would have done that in 1973. Some real change. I actually eventually want to write an article about this. Some real change has happened there, where he's not hostile to Christianity anymore. He regards Christians and Jews as a we. But does that mean that he actually believes in a God outside of that stands outside his vertical authority, that stands outside this system and this modernity? I basically make both cases in the chapter, and then I argue that really the only thing we can be sure of is that his view of the modern condition means you cannot speak about this plainly, and so he will not.
Yeah, fascinating. I want to tie to this last point about you can't speak plainly about religious questions. This is something I kind of gathered, or is that something he says is that more or less the culture is the second order culture is unraveling. And so I was curious about what that means for the future. And maybe this gets into, the very end of his life is when the emergency of
I was just thinking of the passage there. Yeah.
So this is the crisis of the officer class. And in one of the chapters in here, he gets into what a fourth culture might be. And speculating about what a fourth culture might be. Michael, do you want to kind of introduce some of that, and I'll pick up whatever?
Yeah, I don't have the book with me. I left it at home. So the difficulty Rieff wants to say is that for many of us, we have 1 foot in second culture, 1 foot in third culture.
Mm-hmm.
All of us. I mean, if you are alive today, chances are you have 1 foot in each culture, and it's an uneasy existence. It's an uneasy tension between the two. But third culture is gaining ground every day. And there's this passage, which Bill's got handy, I don't, where he speaks about Christians and Jews being united in orthopraxis.
Yes.
And I guess the question is, there's this wonderful description of what culture is that we find early in Death Works, where he says, culture is the form of fighting before the firing begins.
Yeah.
So the question then is, when he speaks of Christians and Jews being united in orthopraxis, is this an alliance for preservation of two, subgroups within second culture, or does he have something, let's say, more religiously significant in mind, as opposed to these are two platoons who share the same goal of being largely left alone by third culture? Do you have the passage handy where he describes fourth culture?
I'm flipping frantically right now.
I might have it. Let me see if I've got it in.
Essentially, what Rieff urges is a merging of Judaism and Christianity, and what Rieff believes, he's incredibly pessimistic about the prospects. He says he can't really describe what a fourth culture would be because he's a partisan of the second, stuck in the third. So understanding what the fourth would be is beyond his ken. But he makes a couple of predictions. And again, this guy is far more pessimistic than Nietzsche.
Yeah.
He is profoundly, deeply pessimistic.
Nietzsche is a starry-eyed optimist
compared to Rieff. And what Rieff says is what he is certain of. And he doesn't make like a big paragraph about this. There's basically a sentence where he says, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's something like this: after the blood-soaked apocalyptic disaster that will be the end of third culture, people will be more than ready to accept authority again. So he believes that the third culture can only end, and he believes in Again, this is someone deeply rooted in what happened to his family in the Shoah. And he believed that the Holocaust was one of the great death works, just like a piece of art attacking the second culture would be. And he believed that's a prologue to the ultimate end of third culture, which he believed would just be an orgy of destruction. He says after that, people are going to be ready to receive the fourth culture. And that part of the fourth culture would be a revival of monasticism, the idea that Jews must be like Christians in their faith, and Christians must be like Jews in their orthopraxis, so that each draws on this strength, which is a limiting strength in conformity with authority. And he urged that remember, the book's called The Crisis of the Officer Class because he believes that the third culture teaching elites are doing something unprecedented. They're refusing to teach anything. All they're doing is attacking the idea that people might forbid something or that there might be limits. That's unprecedented. He said a fourth culture teaching elite is going to be severe in its interdicts, and people are going to go along with it because of the way that the third culture is going to violently unravel. But he says, I don't know what it would look like. He seems to think the disaster is unavoidable, that the third, he has a low view of reason. So he does not believe, he's a good Freudian. And so
reason is a whore, he says.
Yeah, that's exactly what he says. And that basically it's some tool people could use to justify the drives. So you're not going to reason people out of the third culture. And I think, he thinks that the hard lesson is the only way they're going to learn. And there's all kinds of little flickers of apocalypticism in his writing. At one point, he talks about all the glass in modern skyscrapers that are just sitting there begging to be broken, but that it'll be delightful because all the reflections mean that it can watch itself being destroyed in the glass. Like these sort of really dark, he'll just say stuff like that, then move on with his argument. And in that way, he is sort of like Nietzsche. He'll be almost aphoristic sometimes, and then he'll go back to his argument. Reading Rieff is incredibly challenging, but there are moments of incredible beauty, and there are turns of phrase which are rewarding in the way that reading normal philosophy simply isn't. It's not there. He's a bit of an artist himself.
Yeah.
I actually think that's a great way to end the episode with that meditation right there. Gentlemen, thank you both so much. If people, we will plug the book when it comes out, or if there's a place where we can pre-order it, we can put that in the show notes. But
it is up on Amazon already, apparently.
With the wrong title.
Really?
But yeah, it's not. It's the old title before the editor wanted to change it.
Oh, okay.
But if you just type Harding or that, which will be easier to spell than Batchelder, and Rieff in Amazon, the pre-order thing will come up. But it's going to be a minute because we still don't have the final edits back to do. The other things, we can pitch two other things, actually.
Go for it, please.
While we're pitching things, there's this group ISI, and they're having this here conference in November in Wilmington, Delaware. And the Ciceronian Society will be doing a panel on Rieff. The theme of the ISI conference is the golden thread and the idea of going back and learning from the traditional Western culture. And we're going to ask, is the golden thread broken? Because Rieff, like Nietzsche, believed one is not free to be a crab, that you can't actually go back. But then Rieff constantly goes back in his illustrations and allusions. So there's a tension baked into Rieff there. I'm going to talk about that, and our other panelists are going to talk about Rieff in that context. What are the dates of that, Tom? I can't
The
remember.
7th through the 9th of November. This is primarily for faculty and graduate students as opposed to undergrad. At the American Politics and Government Summit, Bill is giving unsolicited free promotion, and we appreciate that.
And another thing that we can promote here is that in Modern Age, which is this group ISI have this journal, on the Modern Age website, I've actually applied the primacy of possibility, in particular in Rieff, to Dune. And they have that article now where I basically argue that Dune is Frank Herbert's death work against the second culture. So I have that interpretation of Dune, which I think is going to be on the website, but I'm not entirely sure when. I sent the final draft in. So that's coming up. And then there'll be panels on Rieff at the Ciceronian Society annual conference in March, which will be held at JMU in Harrisonburg, Virginia. And you can find us at ciceroniansociety.org.
Awesome.
Michael, anything else?
Michael, do you have anything?
No. Bill's covered all of it. Yeah, I'm looking forward to the Ciceronian conference. I'm looking forward to the ISI conference. I'll be attending on a different panel put together by Lubritza.
Awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to both as well. Thank you both again for helping us fill in this hole and give us the mind of who I think is a very trenchant, important thinker, who has probably not gotten as much traction or play as maybe he should. So appreciate.
I might add one last thought about Rieff, if it's not vulgar and indulgent to do so.
Why stop now?
What struck me when I read Rieff for the first time, sitting on a beach in Florida, was that I'm a reasonably well-educated guy. What struck me reading Rieff was that for the first time in I do not know how long, I felt like I was reading something really original. When I was reading Deathworks, I had the experience of turning the page and thinking, I don't know where this guy's going, which was not something I'd really experienced in quite a long time. So if for no other reason, I would encourage people to read Rieff, not just because he's someone who can, I think, really help us think through a lot of the questions that we face today. And I don't left, right, center. I think there's a lot to be found of value in Rieff for thinking through and navigating this particular cultural or civilizational moment. But also because Rieff, he's challenging, he's frustrating. Sometimes he's darkly funny, I think, as we've seen today. But more than anything, he's honestly one of the most original thinkers I've read in the last 25 years. And if for no other reason, people should read Rieff because he's a legitimately new thing to put into your philosophical toolbox for thinking about the world.
And he's not a hack culture warrior. When he examines the high art of modernism, it's from a place of deep horror and deep affection at the same time. He says that their death works are admiring final assaults on the second culture, and he described his book as an admiring assault on them. And so you see someone who actually loves modern art and modern literature while not loving the third culture that it advances. And so this is not some culture warrior sneering at works that teach a worldview that he doesn't believe. This is somebody who is deeply admires and engaged with the intellects even as he's opposing them.
Well, with that, we'll end the episode there. Thank you both.
Thank you for having us very much.
Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our website at isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, debates, lectures, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.